The craftsmanship that it would take to make a bronze Roman dodecahedron would have been very challenging for a metal artisan to make at the time.
12 pentagonal faces, music, 12 circular holes, no two the same size. 20 bronze knobs on the corners, cast at a price that only makes sense for something important. Roughly 130 have come out of the ground across Britain, Gaul, and the Rhine, music, and almost none out of Italy, Greece, or Egypt. For 284 years, nobody could say what they were for. Is remarkable and unusual, because there's not many more than 100 known to exist. Then someone stopped treating them as archaeology and fed the raw measurements to Grok AI, and the same proportion came back from workshops 1,000 miles and 2 centuries apart. Who set that number? The object nobody could name. So the Roman dodecahedron. Just look at that absolutely gorgeous object. Really intricately made. And there's a one over there for you. Look, if you're looking from that camera. A Roman dodeca is small enough to close a hand around. Hollow, cast in bronze or a copper alloy. 12 faces, every face a pentagon. Every one of those 12 faces is pierced with a circular hole, and the holes differ in diameter. Within a single specimen, that variation is not scattered. It steps through sizes in an order that repeats. Every one of the 20 vertices, the points where 3 pentagons meet, carries a small spherical knob. Set it down on any face, and it stands on those knobs. Most examples stand between 4 and 11 centimeters tall. They weigh between roughly 35 and 580 g. Every specimen recovered with a clear archaeological context dates to the music, same window, the 2nd to the 4th century AD. There is no inscription on any of them. No macaque mark, no sealed interior, no hidden compartment. The music object gives up everything it has to the eye in about 4 seconds. Which is exactly the problem. That deserves a pause because it inverts how archaeology usually works. Music, most ancient mysteries, are mysteries of absence. The tablet broken, the tomb looted, the scroll burned. Here, nothing is missing. Roughly 130 exist, and for 284 years, that abundance produced music no answer. Rome makes the silence worse. It documented itself relentlessly in engineering manuals, surveying treatises, letters, and insults scratched into plaster, and Roman writers describe tools nobody has ever found. Here is a tool found more than 100 times over, and not one surviving Roman sentence mentions music. The first was pulled from a field near Aston in Hertfordshire in 1739 and reported to the Society of Antiquaries. Music, the verdict was a shrug, unmistakably Roman, entirely unidentifiable. There is still a huge amount of mystery around music, these very peculiar objects. But one of the most popular theories is that it had a more mystical function. Every find since has repeated it. Undeniable craftsmanship, undeniable expense, undeniable Roman origin, music, and no explanation anywhere. Some came out of plowed fields and building foundations. Some surfaced in old collections whose provenance was already lost. And some were recovered from deliberate burial deposits, packed away alongside coins by someone who thought them worth hiding from whatever is coming. Whatever they were not disposable. Then, as the finds accumulated, a second pattern surfaced, not in the objects, in the map. A map that points somewhere. The dodecahedra do not spread evenly across the empire. They cluster, and the cluster has a shape. They appear in Roman Britain with notable frequency across Gaul, in what is now France, in the Germanic provinces along the Rhine and Danube, in the Alpine provinces, and in Pannonia covering modern Hungary. Now, walk the other half of the map. They are effectively absent from Italy and Greece, from North Africa, Egypt, and Syria, from the great provinces of the eastern Mediterranean, where Roman civilization was oldest, densest, and most heavily documented in surviving writing. That absence is the sharpest fact in the entire case, and it does most of the work. If the dodecahedron were a religious object or a status symbol, the Italian and Eastern heartlands are exactly where it should turn up, because that is where the temples, the cults, and the money were. It does not turn up there. If it were an ordinary household implement, it should appear wherever Romans kept houses, which is everywhere. It does not. What it does is sit almost exclusively in the band of territory where Rome was still actively conquering, garrisoning, and engineering its way into difficult ground. It is common where Rome was building. It is close to invisible where Rome was simply music living. The honest caveat belongs here. Recovery is uneven across the Roman world. And in Britain, a legal framework funnels fines into public records. So part of the northern skew is modern reporting rather than ancient behavior. But the gap is too wide to be a filing artifact. Italy has been dug over obsessively for 4 centuries. If dodecahedra were lying there in numbers, they would have been found by now, which leaves a clue that nobody could spend. Distribution follows function. Whatever this object did, it was tied to the moving edge of the empire rather than its settled interior. And that has been visible in museum catalogs for generations, printed, mapped, available to anyone who cared to look. If a clue sitting in plain sight for 2 centuries does something to you, subscribe now, because the same thing turns out to be true of the answer itself, and it was hiding in the holes. Forged with deliberate precision in pure geometry, a dodecahedron is a solid with 12 flat faces. In the regular form, the one Plato tied to the cosmos itself in a time. Every face is an identical regular pentagon. It is the 5th and strangest of the Platonic solids, and it carried real philosophical weight in the ancient world. The Roman objects are not regular dodecahedra in the strict sense. They are hollow. Every face is open by a circular hole, and the holes vary in size in a controlled, repeating way. The vertices carry spherical knobs that add mass, change how the object sits in the hand, and give it fixed points to stand on or align against. They were produced by lost wax casting. A wax model is built by hand and coated in clay to form a mold. The assembly is heated until the wax runs out, leaving a cavity in the exact shape of the original. Molten metal goes in, and when it cools, the mold is broken away, followed by finishing work with files and abrasives. Nothing about that is casual. Lost wax casting destroys the model and the mold every single time. There is no reusable pattern, no shortcut, no second attempt from the same setup. Every dodecahedron that exists represents a wax original built from scratch by someone who knew how to lay out regular pentagons music and wrap 12 of them into a closed solid without the whole thing failing to meet. The materials were not lying around either. Copper and tin had to be mined, smelted, alloyed, and moved. And music, tin came from a handful of sources. A cast bronze object of any complexity represented a serious commitment of resources, one that could be reversed at any moment because scrap bronze was recycled constantly. Objects that lost their purpose went back into the crucible. That is quietly damning for half the theories. For roughly 130 of these, to survive at all implies a great many more once existed, and that people kept them rather than melting them down. Nobody hoards a novelty, and they are not crude. The pentagonal faces are regular. The circular holes are cleanly cut and consistent in profile. The knobs are uniform. The overall geometry shows manufacturing control that required both mathematical understanding and genuine technical mastery. There is variation between specimens, and it is instructive. Sizes differ, weights differ, finish quality differs. These were not stamped out of one mold in one workshop. They were made repeatedly in different places by different hands across roughly 2 centuries. Different hands, same object, no shared mold. Which raises a question nobody thought to ask for 284 years music, because everybody was busy asking a different one. For theories and how each one breaks. The explanations piled up. Dozens have been proposed, for have carried real weight, and each accounts for part of the object while contradicting another part. Start with the candle holder. The holes take candles of different diameters. The music knobs act as feet and bronze shrugs off heat. It is possible, and a reported trace of wax residue in at least one specimen is the strongest card the theory holds. That report has never been broadly confirmed. And residue inside a hollow object buried for centuries is a fragile foundation for anything. Then ask what a candle holder needs. Music, it needs to hold a candle upright. It does not need regular pentagonal faces, controlled hole ratios, or a skilled bronze caster when fired clay with a socket in it does the job for a fraction of the cost. And it does not need to avoid Italy where candles burned as brightly as they did on the Rhine. Music, the knitting theory, conquered the internet. A researcher demonstrated on video that a dodecahedron can knit the fingers of gloves, the holes serving as frames, music, and the demonstration works. That is its power and its trap because a thing being usable for a task is not evidence it was used for that task. A wine bottle makes a serviceable rolling pin. What sinks it is what has never been found. No fiber residue, no fragment of yarn, no or grooves of a kind, repeated tension leaves, and soft metal on any specimen music ever. Add the geography wrong for a domestic craft practiced across the whole empire, and then the arithmetic. Fingers vary continuously, so glove frames should too. The holes do not. They step in proportion in objects made hundreds of miles apart. The religious reading is harder to kill, and that is precisely its weakness. Plato's fifth solid, the shape of the heavens, an object of cult or divination, buried with valuables because it was sacred. It explains the geometric form better than any rival. It also explains anything else you put in front of it, because ritual absorbs inconvenient details rather than being constrained by them. And a theory that cannot fail cannot be tested. Press it on the details it should own, and it goes quiet. 12 openings of carefully differing sizes are not a symbol. They are a mechanism. Cult objects that survive are overwhelmingly carved, not cast at ruinous expense. And a Platonic emblem that appears on the militarized frontier while avoiding the provinces where Platonic philosophy was taught has its geography exactly backwards. Gaming pieces need the least discussion. Nobody commits that much metal and that much specialist labor to a token. And no Roman game whose rules survive requires anything of music the kind. Look at the shape of the failure. Every theory shuts one door and opens another. The objection has always been the same, and it is a fair one. No Roman text mentions such an instrument. No relief or mosaic shows a surveyor holding one, and Roman art does depict the chroma. Sighting through a hole at arm's length is unsteady work without a mount. Music, and no dodecahedron has ever been found with a fitting for a pole. So the geography fits, and the physics is plausible, and nothing is settled. It is motive without a weapon. To get closer than that, somebody had to stop arguing about purpose and start measuring holes. The number in the bronze. The decisive move came from the direction the field had spent 3 centuries not looking. At the Politecnico Torino, physicist Amalia Sparavinia has published work treating these objects as geometry rather than culture, examining them as possible measuring devices and asking what their dimensions would have to mean if they were. That work stands on its own in the ordinary published record, and it is not an AI result. The modern step is separate and should be described precisely. Documented measurements from specimen after specimen were run through Grok AI as pure numbers stripped of any archaeological label, with one blunt question attached. Are the hole diameters related to each other? And does any relationship survive across objects that have nothing else in common? This was computational analysis of existing measurements. Music, it was not a peer-reviewed study, and it did not produce a proof. What it produced was a pattern, and the pattern has a shape worth stating plainly. Within a single dodecahedron, the 12 holes are not 12 unrelated sizes. They form a graded series. The smallest and the largest sit at the ends of a range, and the 10 between them are spaced, so that each diameter stands in a consistent proportional relationship to the others, rather than in a consistent arithmetic difference. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A series that grows by equal steps, adding the same fixed amount each time, is what you get when someone is dividing up a range by eye or by convenience. A series that grows by a consistent ratio, multiplying rather than adding, is what you get when someone is building a scale. And scales exist for reading values off, not for decoration. Now, the part that makes it strange. The exact proportions drift slightly from object to object, but the underlying structure recurs across specimens cast in different provinces by different workshops at different times over roughly 2 centuries. Set that against what genuinely arbitrary hole sizing would look like, because the contrast is the whole argument. If a craftsman were simply drilling holes to taste, the diameters within one object would land where the tool and the eye put them, and the ratios between them would be different noise in every specimen. Compare 2 objects from different provinces, and you would find no shared structure at all, only 2 unrelated sets of numbers that happen to describe 12 holes. Compare a 100 and you would get a smear. What the analysis reported instead is that the structure keeps reappearing with the scatter you would expect from hand finishing rather than the scatter you would expect from improvisation. The conditions that would be required for that are close to impossible. No central workshop, no shared mold, because lost wax casting destroys the mold every time. No way for a craftsman in Britain to check his work against one in Pannonia. Hundreds of miles and decades between them. And the same relationship turns up anyway. That only happens if the makers were working from a specification that existed independently of all of them. A rule, a standard, something that traveled with the people who needed these objects, taught and reproduced accurately enough that 2 men who never met put the same mathematics into bronze. The caveat has to travel with the finding, and anyone trained in physics reaches for it first. The trouble is that a pattern found in old, corroded, variously cleaned objects can always be an artifact of the damage. What the argument needed was one specimen that had never been touched. In June 2023, in a Lincolnshire field, someone put a tell into the ground and found it. The field at Norton Disney, a community excavation on agricultural land near Norton Disney. Volunteers from the Norton Disney History and Archaeology group doing the slow, unglamorous work that most digs actually consist of. And then a tool reaches something that is not soil and not stone. He stops. He clears the dirt by hand. The way you do when part of you already suspects what is under there. What comes up is a Roman Dodecahedron reported as the largest found in Britain and among the best preserved. All 12 faces present. All 20 knobs intact, surfaces clean enough to scan at high resolution. For a volunteer on a community dig, that is the find of a lifetime arriving out of a plowed field. The people standing around that trench did not need a specialist to tell them what they were looking at. You can imagine the silence, and then the music noise. The object went on public display at Lincoln Museum, and the group worked with academic partners to document it. 3-dimensional scanning produced a precise digital model, the kind that can be measured computationally at a resolution physical handling never allows. And this is where the geometry argument got the only test that could have destroyed it. Every pattern found in the existing corpus carried a quiet vulnerability. Those objects had spent centuries in soil, and corrosion concentrates exactly at the edges of a hole. Add the cleaning history. Specimens recovered in the 18th and 19th centuries were scrubbed, filed, and sometimes reshaped by people with no concept of conservation. Add measurement itself, taken with calipers by different researchers across 2 centuries at different points on an irregular edge to different levels of precision. Stack those 3 sources of error and a genuine worry appears that the ratio was never Roman at all, but a ghost produced by damage and inconsistent recording. That objection cannot be answered by finding the pattern in more damaged objects, because it applies to all of them equally. The Norton Disney specimen answers it because it fails on every count that would make it convenient. It came up near pristine, so the hole edges are close to what the caster left. It was scanned in 3 dimensions at high resolution, so the measurements do not depend on one person's hand and one person's judgment of where an edge is. It was recovered by volunteers on a community dig who were not looking for a mathematical relationship and had no stake in one. And it entered the record after the pattern had already been described, which means it is genuinely unseen data rather than part of the set the pattern was found in. That combination is what falsification requires. If the proportional relationship were an artifact of corrosion, this object should have refused to show it because the corrosion is not there. If it were an artifact of sloppy, historical measurement, high-resolution scanning should have dissolved it. If it were unconscious selection, An independently recovered specimen is where the run of luck ends. The measurements lined up with what had been identified across the wider corpus. It landed where the mathematics said it would, and the picture widens beyond one object. Compiled across more than 100 specimens, the proportional relationships hold with a consistency that is difficult to write off as chance. This is no longer a pattern in a handful of items. It looks like a property of the class. There is one more thread easy to miss. The same regions in the same period produced a small number of icosahedra. 20 triangular faces, far rarer. Another platonic solid. If these things were sacred emblems, the icosahedra should push that reading harder, because you would be looking at a family of cosmic forms. Instead, they carry the same practical signature, varying holes, precise construction, expensive material, not a second class of sacred object, but a variant of the same technology in a different shape. Which means what was read out of the bronze was never a quirk of one form. It was a system running across an empire, and it disappeared without leaving a sentence behind. The language we lost on the best reading currently available. The Roman Dodecahedron were instruments measuring or calibrating devices carried by the people who surveyed and engineered the frontiers built to a shared mathematical standard, so that users in different provinces produced compatible results, and traveling with the engineering apparatus that held Western and Northern Europe under Roman control for centuries. What they measured exactly is still not settled. The rangefinder reading is plausible and unproven. The calibration gauge reading is plausible music and unproven. Nothing here closes the case the way a maker's mark or a single Roman sentence would. But the unsettling part of this story was never the object, and it does not depend on which of those readings wins. Go back to the man in the wet grass. Whatever he was holding, he knew how to use it. And so did the surveyor working the same problem on the Danube. And neither ever wrote it down, because you do not write down the obvious.